Welcome everyone, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for checking out Sarder TV, an idea-sharing platform founded by Russell Sarder, author, investor, and CEO of Netcom Learning. And joining us today remotely in the studio is author and global head of Deloitte AI Institute, Beena Ammanath, here to enlighten us about artificial intelligence, which she details in her latest book, Trustworthy AI. Beena, thanks so much for logging in with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tracy.
So you are currently global head of Deloitte AI Institute. Tell us a little bit about your background and experience and how you ended up here.
That's always a great question to start with. And so I currently lead our Global Deloitte AI Institute, which is really focused on connecting all the different parts of the AI ecosystem from an enterprise lens. My background prior to joining Deloitte about 3 years ago now, I was a CTO for AI at Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Before that, I led AI, data science and innovation at GE. I've been at different organizations, different companies, and across different industries, whether it is the Bank of America and Merrill Lynch and E-Trade to British Telecom to GE to HPE. My background is very diverse, having worked across different industries, and I saw the number one challenge was as AI started becoming real, there's a lot of hype in the market, there's a lot of noise in the market,
Right.
And there's a need to really ground it on what's real and what can companies use today, right? And I saw that as a need in my prior roles. And so for me, I think with Deloitte's, broad breadth of experience and depth, it made sense to become that voice in the market that's really bringing real use cases, the real value of AI from an enterprise lens, taking it from research, taking it beyond headlines to the reality and showing what's happening in the world today, which is being used by some of the largest companies in the world.
So tell us a little bit about your role at Deloitte AI Institute and what exactly are you responsible for?
So I am the founder. I started the Deloitte AI Institute. It was my idea, my vision to really, solve for this problem that I had experienced in my prior life. So I started the institute, and I've been very fortunate to be able to expand it across the globe, because many large companies are trying to deal with the different aspects of it. But think about regulations, right? It is different. AI regulations, just the maturity of regulations or the kind of regulations that's coming is going to be different based whether you are based in EU or Asia or US. So how do you bring that global lens together from a regulation perspective? That's just one dimension, but we're looking at it like, how are banks, for example, using AI across the globe, and bring that, best practices together to not only to our clients but to enterprises across the world. And something that you hear a lot about, right? Ethics and bias. What can companies do today that actually helps solve for the problem? How do you move beyond the headlines to actually the solutions? We also hear a lot about the research that's happening, right? But many times that research is still immature and not ready for the applied AI side. So my role is to really look across all these different dimensions and lead our global team to bring the best practices, the POVs, looking into the future, but very much from an applied AI lens.
In your view, what does it mean to be a female executive in AI? Is it still very heavily male-dominated?
Of course, it's very heavily male-dominated. Whether that's not just true of AI though. It is across tech that we have that problem, right? And it's not just an AI problem. But I do believe AI can be a solution for it, though. So Tracy, I don't know if you know, but I also have a nonprofit that I started 5 years ago called Humans for AI, and it is specifically focused on increasing the number of women and underrepresented minorities in AI, because I think AI can actually be the solution, because it's one of those technologies where you don't need deep tech expertise to be part of the technology space. Think about it, right? Because AI is so much about automating intelligence, there is so much information that's needed from a domain perspective. So if you are building a healthcare AI product, then you need doctors and nurses weighing in, to bring in that subject matter expertise to be able to really automate that intelligence of using AI. Whether if we are building a tool for, say, journalists, right? You need journalists involved, and and the core thesis for Humans for AI is how do we make sure that the doctors or nurses, the journalists, the subject matter experts, how do we make those to be more women and URNs, and in that way bring diversity to the table, not try to make every data scientist have an equal representation, but surround the data scientists with diversity and help fix the problem. So I think that there is I'm an optimist, and I do think AI can actually help us solve this problem that's existed for forever now.
So how is artificial intelligence changing the way we live, in your view?
In every possible way, right? It doesn't, we may not even know that we're using AI, but it's omnipresent. It's in our pockets, in our purses, and it's changed the world. Personally, from our own individual lives, it changed in so many ways, right? Our phones are completely powered by AI. The apps that we use, whether it is to look for directions and find the most optimized path, or whether it is to talk to a customer service representative, a chatbot at your bank, and do business online. So from a personal life perspective, I think it has impacted our lives significantly. And I'm old enough to remember times before.
Aren't we all? Oh yes, yeah, I can relate.
So I definitely remember the days of being able to having to, say, look at a dictionary or look at multiple books to come up with a travel itinerary, for example, right? And all that has now is being powered by AI. Going back to maps, looking through maps to find that optimized path and trying to figure out how to get from one point to the other in the fastest possible way. We just take those for granted. We don't have any more of those address books. It's those little books that we used to have with all our contacts and names and phone numbers and birthdays. It's replaced by technology, and is powered. A lot of it is powered by AI. AI is driving pretty much every aspect of life, or is enhancing it today. From a business perspective, I think there is significant impact happening. We hear a lot of, I like to think about organizations that existed 30 years before versus that started in the last 30 years. The ones that started in the last 30 years are the digitally native companies, and they've always used technology and computers. But the ones that started before, and from my experience, like working at BT and GE, those companies have existed for decades, way before AI even came into play. And I think the impact we're seeing in those traditional domains is really about rethinking the business, whether you call it the digital transformation or enterprise transformation. It's really about how do you bring in these new tools, AI tools, to make your supply chain better, for example, or
That's not working yet, right? The supply chain issues, yeah.
Yeah. So I think there is significant impact. Of course, the level of impact varies from industry to industry.
So what do you think are the key technologies we can leverage in order to take bias out of AI?
I think bias is something that comes up in every conversation in the context of AI. Let me just start out with and say that it is not true that bias is a problem in every AI solution. It is only relevant and true when you're using human data. And the other myth that I really want to dispel is that it is impossible to eliminate all bias. It is impossible to have a completely fair algorithm because that just is never going to happen. So from a business perspective, it is really about saying what level of bias is acceptable for a given scenario, right? Depending on the problem you're trying to solve. I'll give you two examples. One from a healthcare perspective, right? Bias in healthcare, where you are looking at patient data and making a diagnosis. If bias exists, it's a terrible thing, and it can result in bad situations, right? So there, the metrics of measuring bias should be much higher thresholds, right? But if you are using AI to predict a X-ray machine failure by using the machine data, bias doesn't really come into play because it is about just looking at the machine's metrics and trying to figure out is this machine going to fail. So it really depends on the use case, and it also then depends on the thresholds. You hear a lot about facial recognition, for example, right? And how biased and how much of a problem it can cause when law enforcement uses facial recognition to tag criminals, for example. That's a very well-known case, and of course it's terrible if you are tagging criminals and it's not an unbiased algorithm, or it's not been really trained on a diverse data set. But there is facial recognition algorithms being used, Tracy, today at traffic lights to identify kidnapping victims or human trafficking victims, right? Now, in that case scenario, the question is not really about whether this should be completely unbiased, but trying to measure it across human methodology. Meaning, if a facial recognition technology is helping you rescue 30% more victims than you would by just using human eyesight, if it is rescuing even 30% more, even though it is biased, I think that's a decision that needs to be made.
So what do you see as a big trend in artificial intelligence in the next several years? What's on the horizon?
Artificial intelligence is definitely maturing and entering that next phase. And I think we're going to see more of the blending of technologies. What I mean is technologies like metaverse, right, which brings together AI and NFT and AR, VR. It brings, all these different emerging technologies together to create a completely different, technology, right? So I think AI is now entering into that phase where it's going to make more friends and blend with other technologies and result in things like the metaverse. We're going to see more business use cases coming out of it. I envision a future where you and I could be having this conversation in the metaverse. We could be speaking in completely different languages, but our voices will real-time translate, and when I might be speaking in a language that you don't understand, but you hear it in the language you understand, right? So taking simple translate to a level which is real time now, plugged in with the audio and the voice, and is doing all of that real time. So I think there is still a lot to be done with AI. And there is, a lot of ways things are going to evolve over the next few years, even beyond just our regular phones that itself for people like you and me is something we know of a world where that didn't exist, and, you had to use paper books. So
how does one begin to upskill for the future of artificial intelligence work?
Tracy, that's such a great question. I do think every single person should have basic fluency, basic AI fluency, meaning they should understand at a very base level on what does machine learning really mean? What does deep learning really mean? What does neural net really mean? And the reason is not just to be able to ground themselves when they read a headline and say, oh yeah, this is, even though the headline makes it sound all doom and gloom, it's not really applicable to every scenario, right? It's not really applicable to the job I'm in or the track I'm on. So I think the basic AI fluency is absolutely crucial, because in the future we're going to see regulations and you might have to vote on things that are about AI and these emerging technologies. So having that basic fluency, basic understanding of this technology is super important. That doesn't mean you need to go and take a Python class or do coding. You can if you want to, but you don't have to be part of this AI journey. Even though you may not know anything about it, you're actually using it in your day-to-day life today, and you're also using it in your job. You just probably don't know that it's AI powering it, right? So if you want to become part of the AI, career path that's in your, journey, then you really need to have that basic AI fluency.
Do you think they should be teaching kids younger and younger in schools about this, as opposed to, yes, college courses offer it all the time, but what about when kids are younger? Is it something you think schools are starting to do already?
Introduction to AI is a good subject to start including, and I would actually make it broader and say introduction to emerging or digital technologies. If you not elementary school, but definitely in high school, we do have a lot of emphasis on coding, but I think it is to look beyond coding, to have that basic digital technologies, just like we're seeing the push for providing financial literacy training, right? So there is, it's part of the hype where we are seeing, really young elementary school kids, the first grade and second grade, are being taught about AI. And I honestly don't think it's that, we need to do that at this point. But by the time you finish high school, you need to have a good grasp of what are these different technologies, what do they do. So irrespective of whether you become a doctor or a lawyer or an artist, you at least have a basic understanding of how your phone works, and when you read a headline, you at least can ground it in your reality. So I do think high school level introduction to digital or emerging technologies would be a great idea.
And congratulations, you are launching a new book. It is called Trustworthy AI, a business guide for navigating trust and ethics in AI. Tell us a little bit about this book.
So the book is really, about providing a pragmatic view on going beyond those headlines, on really what does ethics mean from a business perspective, right? We hear a lot about the extreme use cases, and there's also a fear that, we need to have these perfectly unbiased algorithms to use, say, for our recruiting algorithms. And yes, there might be. But I really wanted to bring a perspective on there are these extreme scenarios, but there are also scenarios where AI is being used today, and that still needs to be thought about from an ethical perspective. What I mean by that is, every technology has its good and bad, and it is important to also think about the negative impacts of technology and address it. The reason being that if you don't address it upfront, you won't gain trust of your end users, and the technology adoption will be harder. We are living in this interesting era right now where, think about when the first car engine was invented, right? And the first cars came on the road, there were no speed limits. There were not even proper roads, because you had used horses before it. So we don't have the proper roads, we don't have speed limits, we don't have the lanes defined. So there is a balance that needs to be achieved on how do you define the lanes, how do you what speed limits are to come in, because those regulations are being defined. But it doesn't mean that you should wait for it. Every company can do something today to embed trust into their AI systems. And it starts by even considering what's important, what are the principles that they want to think about. So in the book, I cover different dimensions of trustworthy AI and what kind of questions to ask and how do you actually solve for it. It's never going to be the perfectly unbiased algorithm, but it at least will help you address say 60% of the problem or 75% of the problem, but at least it's a starting point.
Now, who can benefit from reading your book? Do you have a target demographic?
Yes, it's board members, C-suite, and really anybody working in an organization. It doesn't matter whether you're using AI or whether you're building AI, but it is for board members and C-suite leaders to really be able to understand, get their hands around this fuzzy topic of ethics, which can tend to be extremely philosophical, but get their arms around it and see what can they do in their organization today to be able to address for trust and ethics.
Now, what is ethical AI and its global impact?
That's a great question, because since we are running in this era right now, where we are in that formation era where there are no speed limits or regulations, right? There is a lot of ways AI could go wrong if you don't proactively think about it. We've seen enough of those headlines of, say, the law enforcement and facial recognition technology, right? Now, if the company that built that software or the company that purchased the software to use it, right, they would have thought about what kind of data sets were used to train this model. Is there any bias in it? How do you mitigate for it? Is this reliable? Is this secure? Does it open vulnerabilities within the software? Does it open vulnerabilities within the rest of our IT systems? It is really at a global level, because ethical AI, there is no single playbook. There is no one answer to how to solve for it. So how do you actually solve for it? How do you bring together the best practices, which is what I've done with the book, to start that process?
And what are the key characteristics of trustworthy AI?
Yeah, I've identified about 13 of them, and by no ways, I'll be upfront, by no ways I would claim that it is the full complete set and that is it. There might be additional dimensions you might need from your business perspective. So, fairness and unbiased is obviously, on top of the list, but then there is, safety. When you are, using AI or building AI, does it cause any emotional harm, psychological harm? Does it cause mental harm, right? So safety, not only from physical, but all different aspects, right? Then there is security, which is really about opening out additional vulnerabilities. There is being responsible. Is this the right thing to do for humanity? Right? Just because you're building an AI tool and you are laser focused on the positive impact, just pausing and thinking so that we can avoid that Jurassic Park scenario of just because your scientists could, they did without thinking whether they should. We don't want to, so is this the responsible thing to do? Is this something I want to build and release out into the world? And then there is the robustness and reliability. Will the AI tool behave consistently, produce consistent results, no matter what kind of data is thrown at it? We've seen enough examples where a chatbot has gone racist because the AI tools that we use today are primarily based on machine learning, which learns and evolves over time. So once it's in production, it can still, the outputs can still change. So how do you make sure it is robust and reliable in the real world? Those are some of the dimensions that we cover.
So tell us, what factors actually influence AI reliability?
Tracy, that's such a great and important question. Nobody thinks about reliability in the context of AI and trust, but I think it is super important. And here's why. AI today is, AI is a broad umbrella, but today it is mostly machine learning algorithms. And what that means is the AI tool, the AI solution that you build can change. The outputs of it can change over time based on the data set it's fed in real time. It might have been trained on a data set that was diverse and that was all good, but once in the real world, bad actors can come in and train and change the outputs of that data set. We've seen enough scenarios where companies put out chatbots to be able to engage real time and build better customer relations But we've also seen where bad actors come in and then influence and train that chatbot to go racist. And the reason is that machine learning algorithm is evolving and changing based on the data it keeps getting. So reliability, making sure that the data that is output stays consistent, stays reliable over time, is super important to make sure that your AI solution can be trusted.
So how do you actually develop reliable AI in this scenario?
So in this scenario, it is really, or in every scenario, it is really about thinking about what are the ways that this could go wrong, imagining what a bad actor could do, and then mitigating it. Thinking beyond not just the data that you have on your hand and that you're training your model on, thinking about what are the different kinds of data that can come into your system once it's out into the world, being proactively looking at all possible scenarios, evaluating it, and then putting in those guardrails in place so that if you have a bad actor who's trying to train your model towards racist behavior, you have the guardrails in place to prevent it.
So what are the biggest challenges that impact trust in the AI application?
The biggest challenges that are more of the unknown ones. It is, I think we hear a lot about fairness and bias because that's easy, but as I said, that's really not relevant if you're not using human data, right? And let's stick on bias for a second. So even within the in the bias scenario, it really depends on the use case. AI is all about context. So say there is biased AI in law enforcement, which flags criminals, or in patient care for healthcare systems. That is terrible, right? But bias in a marketing campaign data, tool, maybe not as bad. You might see a different, dress than you should have seen based on your prior shopping experience. But that's not as bad as getting a bad diagnosis. So, Tracy, there is no one size fits all. AI is all about context, and the solutions for trust and ethics will also depend on the context. As I was saying, if you think about the facial recognition example, right, it depends on the use case to then think about what are the trust metrics, whether it is bias or reliability, to think about trust metrics and implement them. So I think, realizing that it's not a one size fits all, it is always dependent on the use case. That's what's going to help us make progress.
And how do you embed AI ethics in business processes and your decision making? Is that something you're tackling daily?
Oh, that is a great question. Look, I'm a technologist by training. I have built tech solutions my entire career for the past several decades. And every project team that whether I've been part of or whether I've led, there is a big focus on ROI, return on investment. What value are you going to get by doing this project? Now, it can be cost savings or it can be new revenue opportunity, but we focus a lot on the ROI, the value creation. Even if making one simple change in your project plan, in your process of adding an additional column which says, what are the ways this could go wrong, right? And that's just one simple change. And you don't even have to spend hours. Even if you just add that one in, it will force a conversation because it's the team that's building it or that's using it that understands that domain. And if they can think about what are the positive impacts, I'm sure they can come up with a few negative impacts. And once they know it, once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Now you have to make sure you put in the guardrails to actually prevent those negative scenarios, right? Wouldn't it be great if you had one column in there right next to the ROI, which says, think about the ways this could go wrong, and just spend, 2%, 5% of your time to figure that out. I think that's a great starting point in terms of process changes, but there are so many different things you can do to get started.
So where are the great opportunities to build ethics into novel AI?
I'm an optimist, like I said, and I know there are, several different things that AI can bring value to all of us. And especially as you think about, AI blending with these other technologies and creating even more novel technologies, I think there are a few core factors you need to think about: the impact, the harm that it can cause to humanity in general, right? And it doesn't need to be just about, I mean, we hear a lot about self-driving cars and who is it going to hit? Is it the pedestrian or the other car, right? That's physical harm that's easy for us to relate to, but also think about the mental harm, the psychological harm of putting out a tool that might be changing your thinking, that might be impacting teen behavior, right? So I think it's important to think about the harm it can cause to humanity. It's important to always take a pause, especially for novel technologies. Is this the right thing to do for humanity? It might be the right thing to do from a pure business perspective because it's new revenue. But is that really something you want your legacy to be, where you want to leave that behind, which has made humanity worse? The third thing I would say is think about, who is it going to leave behind? Is this technology going to drive more inequity in the world? Will everybody have access to this technology? What happens to those who don't have access to this technology? Are they going to get left behind? So thinking about it from an inequity perspective is important. The fourth one I would say is really, the sustainability, right? So the impact to the planet, right? We know new technologies consume a lot of power and energy, and their carbon footprint is huge. So how are you going to mitigate for it? How do you justify on building this new technology which is going to impact the planet in a worse way? So society, sustainability, inequity, these are all the big, broad questions you need to start thinking about when you are enamored by a new novel technology and can see all the cool business value it brings. Think about what are the ways that it could go wrong. How does it impact the broader society, the planet, and humans? And make that more mindful, thoughtful decision, not just a pure, profit decision.
Now, finally, what advice would you give to the workforce that's just starting out in this niche area?
I have two teenagers, and they are digitally native, and they are extremely tech savvy. And but my hope is because of their early start, they are hopefully also very much thinking about the ethical, the negative, the risks associated with these technologies, right? Whether it is the getting addicted to a technology, the mental harm that it could cause, whether it is using technology that is driving inequity. I think for the future workforce, I would say, we are at a moment in time when you have the opportunity to actually choose that path which drives to more equity and sustainability and leaves the planet in a better place.
Well, Beena, thank you so much for all your invaluable insights and best of luck with your new book.
Tracy, thank you so much for having me.
And that's it for this edition of Sarder TV. We hope you enjoyed and learned something new today. Until next time, I'm Tracy Fitzpatrick. Thanks for watching.